The ledgers of Briarwood Hall, preserved in the archives of Natchez, Mississippi, detail the acquisition of the estate in 1842 with a cold precision that borders on the gratuitous. The property encompassed 18,000 acres of prime river bottom land, a holding that secured Judge Silas Vance's position as the preeminent force in the region's civic and agricultural life. The inventory lists 312 souls held in bondage, categorized alongside livestock and farming implements, in a ruthless exercise of dehumanization. According to the diaries of contemporary observers, Vance viewed his accumulated assets not merely as wealth, but as a validation of his moral and intellectual superiority over his fellow man. His marriage to Isadora, the daughter of a declining Virginia dynasty, was recorded as a final necessary acquisition, sealing his status among the Southern aristocracy with a veneer of old-world legitimacy that his new-found money could not purchase alone. Judge Vance was a man of 59 years, his countenance etched with the deep lines of a lifetime spent adjudicating the lives of others from the bench and the auction block. His political ascendancy had been forged in the crucible of the Mississippi Delta, where he parlayed cotton yields into legislative seats and judicial appointments with a calculated efficiency that awed his associates and terrified his dependents. He managed his human property with the same detached rigor he applied to legal statutes, viewing enforced labor as the natural order of a civilized society, and any dissent as a personal affront to his authority. The estate functioned as an extension of his nervous system, responding to his slightest gesture with a Pavlovian obedience that rendered the line between a man and a landowner indistinguishable. Isadora entered this world in 1847, a transaction sealed with a handshake and a dowry rather than a vow, her future mortgaged to settle her father's gambling debts. The marriage contract, unearthed in a probate dispute years later, reveals the stark materialism underlying the union, specifying the transfer of deeds and titles while omitting any mention of affection or partnership. Isadora Vance was 20 years old when she was delivered to the mansion, a structure designed by a renowned New Orleans architect to project an aura of invincible serenity. Behind the white columns and the imported English wallpaper, however, the domestic sphere was as rigidly stratified as the cane fields that stretched toward the horizon. The couple occupied separate wings of the residence, a physical division that mirrored the emotional chasm widening between them, enforced by a code of silence that Isadora quickly learned to adopt. For Silas, a wife was a necessary ornament for political galas, a hostess to pour tea for visiting dignitaries, and a vessel for an heir, functions that required presence but not intimacy. By the summer of 1852, the Briarwood estate had become a self-sustaining engine of profit and fear, its machinery oiled by the sweat of those who toiled under the watch of overseer Mr. Pinter. The heat that summer was noted in agricultural reports as particularly relentless, a stifling blanket of humidity that slowed the movement of man and beast alike, pressing down on the delta with the weight of a physical hand. Isadora moved through the rooms of the mansion like a ghost tethered to the earth by silk dresses and whalebone corsets, her daily routine a performance of leisure that masked a profound and suffocating isolation. She had fulfilled the duties of her station for 5 years without complaint, mastering the art of being seen without being heard, of offering tea without offering a piece of herself, a performance that left her hollowed out and spiritually adrift. Financial records from the period indicate that Judge Vance expended $8,000 on renovations to the main house that year, a sum that reflected his desire to cement his legacy in brick and mortar. The additions included a library filled with legal treatises and classical works, a room Isadora was permitted to enter only to dust or to fetch a volume for her husband. It was here, amidst the bound silence of the written word, that she began to feel the first stirrings of a rebellion she could not yet name, a desperate hunger for a connection that was not transactional. She had long since ceased to weep, the tears drying up as the reality of her permanent state settled over her, like the dense grey moss draping the live oaks outside her window. The world outside the manicured gardens was a terrifying unknown, but the world inside was a slow death. The household staff, a skeleton crew of house servants, managed with iron discipline by the aging matriarch Aunt Cece, navigated the domestic minefield with practiced wariness. They observed the mistress's growing listlessness, the way she took her meals alone in her chambers with increasing frequency, and the heavy silence that descended over the dining room when the judge was in residence. In the quarters behind the main house, whispers circulated about the lack of an heir, a failure that the judge's peers attributed to his wife's frailty rather than his own neglect. Isadora was aware of these murmurs, the sideways glances and the sudden cessation of conversation when she entered a room, but she lacked the power to alter the narrative. Her value, like that of the field hands, was determined solely by her utility to the master, and her utility was rapidly depreciating in the face of her childlessness. It was in this atmosphere of mounting pressure and suspended animation that the currents of the estate began to shift, unseen by the judge, but felt acutely by those who lived in the shadow of his whip. The rhythm of the plantation was dictated by the needs of the crop, and the late spring planting season had demanded a reorganization of the labor force to maximize efficiency. Judge Vance, ever the micromanager, had authorized the relocation of several skilled laborers from the outlying repair shops to the immediate vicinity of the main house to address a backlog of maintenance issues. This administrative decision, recorded as a marginal note in the plantation's daybook, was a routine exercise of managerial prerogative. Yet it carried consequences that would ripple through the foundation of the Vance dynasty. The logic was economic, the result purely practical. But the introduction of new variables into the closed system of the mansion's orbit was a miscalculation of profound proportions. Isadora's restlessness had begun to manifest physically, driving her to pace the verandas in the early hours of the morning before the household stirred. The strictures of her upbringing dictated that a lady's place was indoors, engaged in needlepoint or the supervision of the kitchen. But the walls of Briarwood had begun to feel like the sides of a coffin. She found herself drawn to the sounds of the working yard, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, and the lowing of cattle, a world that was brutal but undeniably vital. The contrast between her sterile existence and the raw, painful vitality of the enslaved workforce was a constant reproach to her situation. She had been shielded from the harsher realities of the estate's operation, a courtesy afforded to white women of her station, but the veneer of gentility was wearing thin under the strain of her own unacknowledged despair. On a morning in late May, the atmospheric pressure broke in a sudden thunderstorm, leaving the air washed clean and unnervingly bright, a detail noted in the letters of a neighbor. Driven by an impulse she did not bother to analyze, Isadora descended the stairs and crossed the threshold of the back garden, walking past the manicured hedges toward the smell of sawdust and manure. She was not looking for anything specific, merely escaping the suffocating perfumed air of the parlor. But fate had already drafted a different trajectory for her steps. The repair sheds sat at the edge of the lawn, a cluster of buildings where the tools of production were mended by hands, deemed valuable only for their utility. It was a liminal space, a borderland between the refined cruelty of the big house and the raw suffering of the fields, a place where a lady of her standing had no legitimate business. As she approached the stables, a figure emerged from the shadows of the open doorway, carrying a heavy yoke for the oxen with a fluidity that belied the weight of the burden. He was a man of perhaps 30 years, his frame lean and powerful, his skin reflecting the deep, rich hues of the earth after rain. Isadora stopped, caught off guard by the sheer physical reality of him, a presence that commanded the space around it with a quiet authority the judge could never mimic. He did not lower his gaze or step aside as protocol demanded. Instead, he paused, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment that seemed to fracture the humid air. In that silent exchange, the rigid hierarchy of Briarwood Hall trembled, though the judge himself remained entirely ignorant of the fissure opening beneath his feet. The man standing before her was listed in the estate's inventory as Jonah, designated property number 62, a human asset acquired 5 years prior to settle a debt in Vicksburg. Isadora had seen him from a distance on previous occasions, a shape moving in the periphery of her vision, but proximity stripped away the comfortable abstraction of distance. He was dressed in the rough Osnaburg shirt and trousers issued to the labor force, clothes stained with the grease and soil of his trade, yet he carried himself with a composure that defied his condition. The record books assigned him a value of $1,200, a fluctuating figure dependent on his health and the demands of the market. But such calculations failed to capture the intensity of his gaze. He did not look away, nor did he offer the submissive bow that Judge Vance demanded from all who served him, creating a moment of profound impropriety that hung suspended in the morning air. Isadora felt a jolt of something unfamiliar, a mixture of terror and fascination that rooted her to the spot, rendering her unable to perform the ritual of dismissal that her status required. The silence between them stretched, unbroken by the distant sounds of the waking house or the lowing of cattle in the pens nearby. It was a violation of the strict social script that governed every interaction on the plantation, a script written in blood and enforced by the lash. Yet neither party seemed willing or able to adhere to their assigned lines. In that fissure of time, Isadora saw not a piece of property, but a man assessing her with a clarity that pierced through the layers of silk and privilege that constituted her armor. She was suddenly aware of her own breathing, of the tightness of her corset, and of the vast, unbridgeable chasm of power that separated them, even as something fundamental and unrecognized connected them. "You," she said, the word escaping her lips as a whisper, barely audible above the rustling of the oak leaves overhead. It was not a command, but a question, a tentative step onto ground that was dangerously unstable. "What is your name?" He did not shift his weight or drop his eyes, maintaining that unnerving stillness that seemed to draw the very heat of the day into his frame. "Jonah, ma'am," he replied, his voice low and resonant, carrying a texture of strength that felt like a physical weight against her chest. It was a voice accustomed to silence, to speaking only when addressed, yet it held no trace of the fear she had heard in the voices of other field hands when confronted by a white face. The name settled between them, a simple monosyllable that nonetheless felt like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. Isadora repeated it internally, feeling the shape of it, the reality of it, and in doing so, she unknowingly marked the beginning of her own unraveling. She turned away without a further word, her legs carrying her back toward the mansion with a haste that bordered on impropriety, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The encounter should have been trivial, a momentary breach of etiquette, quickly forgotten in the rush of daily duties, but the sensation of his eyes on her back lingered like a brand. She felt exposed in a way she had never felt in the presence of her husband or his peers, as if Jonah had seen through the porcelain facade of the mistress to the frightened woman beneath. The walk back to the house seemed interminable, the white columns of briarwood looming up ahead like the bars of a cage she was voluntarily re-entering, a realization that brought a sudden, sharp sting of tears to her eyes. That night, the silence of the master bedroom felt oppressive, a heavy blanket that muffled thought and suffocated rest. Judge Vance lay beside her, his breathing deep and rhythmic, the sleep of a man untroubled by conscience or the consequences of his actions. Isadora lay rigid, her hands clasped across her stomach, staring up at the canopy of the four-poster bed, seeing nothing but the memory of that unyielding gaze. She tried to dismiss the incident as a moment of weakness, a fancy born of heat and boredom, but the image of Jonah refused to be relegated to the background noise of the estate. For the first time in her 5 years at Briarwood, she felt a crack in the walls of her resignation, a dangerous stirring of curiosity that demanded satisfaction. The following morning, she found herself drawn to the window of the upstairs parlor, a vantage point that overlooked the repair sheds and the paths leading to the field. It was a shameful act, she knew, a violation of the unspoken agreement between mistress and servant to maintain a veil of invisibility over the workings of the plantation. Yet, she stood there for nearly an hour, watching the figures move about their tasks, searching for a specific silhouette among the anonymous shapes of labor. When she finally spotted Jonah crossing the yard with a load of timber on his shoulder, she felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the rising temperature of the day. The distance between them was safe, controlled by the pane of glass and the social order, but the desire to close that gap was becoming a physical ache. She began to invent reasons to be out of the house, citing the need for air or a desire to inspect the kitchen gardens, excuses that the household staff accepted without comment. Her movements, once predictable and confined to the domestic sphere, became erratic, driven by an internal compass pointing toward the stables and the repair yard. She was aware of the risk she was taking, the whispers that might arise if her behavior deviated too far from the norm, but the compulsion was stronger than the fear of judgment. The estate, once a prison of monotony, now seemed fraught with hidden pathways and potentialities, a landscape transformed by the presence of a single individual who refused to be invisible. 3 days after the first encounter, Isadora took a deliberate step that moved her from the realm of accidental proximity into the territory of intent. The garden path wound past the rear of the stables, a route she had rarely traversed in the past, preferring the manicured walks of the front lawn. On this morning, however, she turned her feet toward the working heart of the plantation, drawn by a gravitational pull she no longer wished to resist. The air was thick with the scent of hay and manure, the raw olfactory evidence of the labor that sustained her husband's wealth. It was a smell she had been taught to find offensive, yet now it struck her as honest, more real than the artificial perfumes of the parlor. She found him by the irrigation pump, stripping a length of wire to repair a valve, his hands moving with the same quiet competence she had witnessed before. He did not look up immediately, allowing her a moment to study the lines of his shoulders and the tension in his jaw, evidence of a life spent resisting the pressure to break. When he finally acknowledged her presence, it was with a slight nod, a gesture of minimal compliance that nonetheless conveyed a startling degree of mutual recognition. Isadora felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the solid foundations of her world tilting toward an axis she could not control. The point of no return had been crossed, though the tragedy it foretold was still hidden behind the veil of the future. "You are working here today," she said, a statement of the obvious that served only to bridge the crushing silence. Her voice trembled, lacking the authoritative timbre she usually employed with the servants, betraying the agitation that roiled beneath her bonnet. "Yes, ma'am," Jonah answered, his tone even and careful, devoid of the sycophancy she was accustomed to receiving. "The pump needs mending." He did not elaborate or offer excuses, simply stating the fact of his labor, a reality that required no justification. The banality of the exchange stood in stark contrast to the intensity of the unspoken current running between them. Isadora realized with a start that she was waiting for him to look at her again, searching for that spark of defiance she had seen in the stables. She wanted to be seen, not as the mistress of Briarwood, but as Isadora, a person capable of feeling something other than the ennui of privilege. It was a desire that carried the weight of treason against the social order, a betrayal of the hierarchy that her husband held sacred. "We are expecting rain," she continued, the words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to prolong the interaction, to keep him in her orbit for just a few seconds longer. She gestured vaguely toward the horizon, where clouds were indeed beginning to gather, dark and heavy with the promise of a storm. The observation was meaningless, a trivial comment on the weather, but in the context of their stations, it was an overture of startling intimacy. "The corn will welcome it," Jonah replied, glancing briefly at the sky before returning his attention to the wire in his hands. "Roots are thirsty." It was an observation born of the land, a connection to the soil that Isadora, raised in parlors and finishing schools, could never fully possess. He spoke with an authority that Judge Vance lacked, the authority of one who worked the earth, rather than one who merely owned it. Isadora lingered for a moment longer, watching his hands work the metal, noting the scars that mapped the terrain of his skin. She wanted to ask him about those scars, to understand the history written on his body, but the words died in her throat, choked by the weight of propriety and the fear of the answer. She turned and walked slowly back toward the mansion, the rustling of the corn leaves in the rising wind sounding like a warning whisper from the fields. The die had been cast, the first move made in a game that could only end in ruin. Yet she felt a strange, terrifying exultation that drove away the numbness which had plagued her for so long. The kitchen garden at Briarwood served a dual purpose in the estate's economy, functioning simultaneously as a utilitarian source of herbs and vegetables, and as a buffer zone between the domestic sphere of the big house and the labor-intensive yards beyond. It was here, in the shadow of the smokehouse, that the social architecture of the plantation was most visibly policed. Isadora's presence in this liminal space was technically within her rights as mistress, yet her frequency there began to attract the notice of the house staff. She would wander the rows of mint and rosemary, her bonnet shielding her face from the sun and the prying eyes of the servants, waiting for the sound of heavy boots on the gravel path. The garden was becoming a confessional, a place where the strict laws of hierarchy bent under the weight of her intent. Judge Vance, a man whose political career had been built on the meticulous gathering of intelligence, had instilled a culture of surveillance that permeated every level of his domain. The house servants were extensions of his will, trained to observe and report any deviation from the established order. Yet Isadora's actions remained frustratingly ambiguous. She was not stealing, nor was she shirking her duties. She was simply present, a ghost haunting the perimeter of the working world. This ambiguity brought her a brief respite from direct confrontation, but the tension of maintaining the facade began to fray her nerves. Every rustle in the hedgerow sounded like the approach of her husband. Every shadow seemed to conceal an overseer ready to expose her transgression to the light of day. Jonah, whose awareness of the dangers of his position was far more acute than Isadora's, initially kept his interactions to the barest minimum of civility. He had been a piece of property long enough to know that the whims of a mistress were as changeable as the river weather, and that the penalty for misinterpreting a glance was often death. Yet, as the days turned into a week, and her presence became a ritual, he began to speak with more than just monosyllables. It started with practical observations about the plants, the blight affecting the tomatoes, the need for rain on the beans. Subjects that were safe, anchored in the physical reality of the soil. This professional discourse created a bridge between their worlds, allowing a dialogue that the estate's code would have otherwise forbidden. Isadora discovered that Jonah possessed a profound, autodidactic knowledge of the land, a wisdom drawn from decades of forced intimacy with the earth. He spoke of the cycles of the moon and the movement of the river with a poetic cadence that captivated her, a stark contrast to the dry, profit-driven analysis she heard at the dinner table. She realized that his silence was not a void, but a reservoir of thought and feeling held in check by the necessity of survival. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The man standing before her in the coarse, stained clothes of a field hand possessed a richness of spirit that her husband, with all his libraries and ledgers, could never hope to attain. This intellectual recognition fanned the flames of her fascination, transforming it into a dangerous admiration. By mid-June, the conversations had drifted away from the safety of horticulture and toward the treacherous ground of personal history. Isadora, driven by a hunger to know him fully, asked a question that violated the unspoken boundary of their arrangement. She asked about his past, a subject that the estate's records had reduced to a bill of sale and a list of previous owners. The air grew heavy with the impropriety of the inquiry, and for a moment she feared he would retreat into the protective shell of silence. But he did not. He paused in his work, leaning on his hoe, and looked at her with a gaze stripped of the guarded neutrality he usually employed, revealing a flicker of profound, ancient grief. "Had a wife once, name of Ruth," he said, his voice barely louder than the buzzing of the cicadas. "Sold south to a planter in Louisiana, round Baton Rouge, 7 years gone now." The words were delivered without accusation, yet they struck Isadora with the weight of a verdict. He spoke of a daughter, too, a child named Clara, whom he had last seen clinging to her mother's skirt on the auction block, a memory that etched a deep line of pain into his brow. The narrative of his life was one of fracture and loss, a chain of human connections severed by the cold logic of commerce, a reality that Isadora had previously known only as an abstract economic footnote. Isadora felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the moral certainties of her upbringing dissolving in the heat of his testimony. She had been taught that the enslaved were incapable of deep familial bonds, a lie necessary to sustain the institution that fed her silk gowns and imported furnishings. Hearing the raw hurt in Jonah's voice shattered that comfortable delusion, forcing her to confront the human cost of the luxury she inhabited. A lump formed in her throat, choking off the platitudes she might have once offered. She realized that her sympathy was worthless, a coin that held no currency in the world he inhabited, yet she felt compelled to offer it nonetheless. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words feeling thin and insufficient against the magnitude of his loss. "Sorrow don't fix the past, ma'am," Jonah replied, his tone gentle but firm, rejecting the easy absolution she attempted to grant. "But it eases the carrying." This exchange marked a turning point in their relationship, a crossing of the Rubicon from which there was no retreat. He had allowed her to see his wound, and she had acknowledged its validity, a mutual recognition that stripped away the layers of performance required by their stations. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the power dynamic that defined every aspect of life at Briarwood was subtly but irrevocably inverted. They were no longer mistress and property, but two souls acknowledging a common humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it. The immediate danger of this shift was masked by the mundane routine of the garden, the rhythmic snip of shears, and the rustle of leaves providing a cover for the radical nature of their connection. Isadora began to arrive earlier each morning, driven by a compulsion that overrode her instinct for self-preservation. She brought him small gifts from the big house, a cup of coffee, a biscuit wrapped in a linen napkin, tokens of care that were technically within her rights to dispense, but which carried a significance far beyond their material value. These offerings were accepted with a quiet gratitude that deepened the bond between them, weaving a web of intimacy that grew more tangled and fragile with each passing day. While the two principals were lost in the gravity of their evolving connection, the infrastructure of surveillance around them was beginning to stir. Aunt Cece, the elderly woman who ruled the kitchen with an iron hand, was the first to decode the subtle shifts in the morning routine. She noted the missing biscuits, the specific selection of the finest napery, and the faraway look in the mistress's eyes when she returned from her walks. Cece had survived 50 years of bondage by understanding the weather patterns of white folks' moods, and she recognized the gathering storm with a dread that settled in her bones. She said nothing to the judge, not yet, but her silence was a calculated delay, a hope that the strange fever would break before it consumed them all. The illusion of safety began to fray at the edges as the summer solstice approached, bringing with it a suffocating heat that seemed to stifle rational thought. The judge, whose attention had been consumed by a contentious legislative session in Jackson, returned to Briarwood with his senses sharpened by political combat. He noticed the change in his wife almost immediately. The flush in her cheeks, the brightness in her eyes, and the way she hummed snippets of songs she had not played on the piano in years. To a man who viewed human behavior as a series of transactions, her unexplained contentment was a discrepancy in the ledger that demanded investigation, a variable in his domestic equation that he had not accounted for. The trap was beginning to close, though the prey remained oblivious to the tightening of the spring. The transformation in Isadora was not merely internal. It began to manifest in the tangible accounting of the household, a domain usually governed by strict predictability. The kitchen ledgers from late June 1852 reveal a subtle but distinct pattern of disruption, specifically in the requisition of luxury foodstuffs. Items previously reserved for formal dinners, imported coffee, fine preserves, cuts of cured ham, began to disappear from the larder with a frequency that confounded the household's routine bookkeeping. Aunt Cece, the matriarch of the kitchen staff, noted these discrepancies not with alarm, but with a heavy, resigned dread. She observed the mistress gathering these provisions herself, bypassing the established chain of command, a violation of protocol that signaled a profound shift in her loyalties. The destination of these goods was never recorded in the official estate logs, but the trajectory was clear to those who watched. They were being carried into the garden. As the inventory of the pantry shifted, so too did the nature of the discourse within the garden walls. The initial reticence that had defined their interactions gave way to a hunger for intellectual exchange that terrified Isadora, even as it exhilarated her. She began to smuggle books out of the judge's library, volumes of poetry and history that she concealed beneath her apron, risking a severe reprimand to share the contents of her mind. In the shadow of the trellis, she read to Jonah, her voice trembling, as she spoke words that were never meant to pass the lips of a field hand. Jonah listened with an intensity that bordered on reverence, his mind absorbing the verses with a facility that suggested an innate, untapped brilliance. This exchange of knowledge was a radical act of equality, a subversion of the laws that forbade the education of the enslaved, and it bound them together with chains far stronger than any iron. The protagonist's isolation, once a monolithic fact of her existence, began to fracture under the weight of this new connection. Isadora found herself chronicling her internal life in a series of secret letters she never dared to post, documents that historians would later describe as the Briarwood fragments. In these writings, she articulated the sensation of being truly seen for the first time, describing Jonah not as a servant, but as the sole auditor of her soul. She wrote of the suffocating silence of the mansion, the cold sterility of her marriage bed, and the stark contrast with the vibrant, dangerous vitality she found in the garden. These confessions, hidden in a hollow space of her wardrobe, served as a testament to her growing psychological dependence on the relationship. She was no longer drifting in a sea of ennui. She was actively swimming toward a waterfall, propelled by a desperate need for authenticity. Jonah, for his part, began to share the oral history of his people, a repository of memory and resistance that existed entirely outside the written record of the White Masters. He spoke of the Middle Passage as a lingering nightmare passed down through generations, and of the secret songs that carried maps to freedom in their lyrics. He recounted the history of the land before the cotton monoculture, describing the deep forests and the herds of game that had once roamed freely, a world that had been erased to make way for the empire of the Vances. For Isadora, this was an education more vital than any she had received in her finishing schools, a revelation of the world hidden beneath the surface of her privilege. She began to see the estate not as a monument to civilization, but as a necropolis built on stolen ground, a realization that fundamentally altered her perception of her own place within it. The atmosphere of the estate grew heavier as July approached, the humidity thickening into a tangible barrier that seemed to separate the inhabitants of Briarwood from the rest of the world. The heat served as a pressure cooker for the illicit relationship, intensifying the emotions and lowering the thresholds for error. Isadora's visits to the garden became the fixed points of her day, the only hours in which she felt truly alive, a dependency that eroded her customary caution. She began to lose track of the time she spent there, often returning to the house only minutes before the judge was due to arrive for his midday meal. The risk of discovery was escalating by the day, but the fear of discovery was increasingly outweighed by the terror of losing the only source of light in her grey existence. While Isadora struggled to maintain her composure within the walls of the mansion, the dynamic between her and Jonah on the outside was shifting toward a perilous intimacy. They maintained the strict physical distance mandated by law and custom, a chasm of several feet that separated the hem of her dress from the dust of his boots. Yet, the emotional distance between them had collapsed entirely. They stood close enough that she could smell the scent of cedar and sweat on his skin, a raw, earthy aroma that intoxicated her senses. The prohibition against touch served only to heighten the awareness of the other's body, charging the air between them with a static electricity that threatened to spark at any moment. It was a torment of restraint, a discipline of denial that left Isadora trembling with a frustrated desire she had never felt for her husband. The surveillance network of the estate, dormant for weeks, began to twitch with renewed activity as the staff picked up on the altered frequencies of the household. The house servants, moving like ghosts through the corridors, noted the frequency of the mistress's trips to the garden and the specific timing of the handyman's assignments. There were no direct accusations, but the atmosphere in the kitchen grew tense, punctuated by meaningful glances and unspoken warnings. The enslaved community lived in a state of hyper-awareness, understanding that a misstep by one could result in punishment for all. They saw the trajectory of the relationship with a clarity that Isadora lacked, recognizing the historical pattern of the transgressing mistress and the doomed slave. The protective silence of the quarters was holding, but it was strained to the breaking point by the reckless nature of the affair. Judge Vance, a man whose political instincts were as sharp as his judicial mind, began to notice the subtle shifts in his wife's daily routine. He observed that she was spending less time in the drawing room and more time walking the grounds, a deviation from her usual sedentary habits. Her demeanor had changed. She seemed distracted, frequently losing the thread of conversation during meals, her mind clearly wandering to a place he could not access. To a man accustomed to absolute control, this opacity was intolerable. He did not yet suspect the specific nature of her secret, but he recognized the symptoms of a variable slipping from his grasp. The judge's response was characteristically methodical. He began to ask casual, probing questions of the house staff, testing the loyalty of his informants, and searching for cracks in the facade of his domestic order. The tension crested one afternoon when Isadora, lost in the rapture of a particularly intense conversation with Jonah, failed to notice the approach of Mr. Pinter, the overseer. Pinter, a man of violent temperament and sycophantic devotion to the judge, had been inspecting the irrigation lines on the far side of the garden wall. The sound of his boot scraping against the gravel path snapped Isadora back to reality with a jolt of adrenaline. She turned to see him standing on the perimeter, his eyes narrowed in suspicion as he took in the scene. The mistress of the house in deep conversation with a field hand, the two of them standing far closer than propriety allowed. The moment stretched into an agonizing silence, broken only by the buzzing of insects in the oppressive heat. Isadora forced a smile, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and offered a hurried explanation about the poor state of the herb garden and the need for expert attention. She moved away from Jonah with a haste that bordered on panic, putting a safe distance between them before Pinter could articulate the accusation forming in his mind. Jonah, for his part, immediately dropped his gaze and resumed his work, his body language shifting seamlessly back into the posture of submission required for survival. Pinter watched them go, his expression unreadable. But the incident had been witnessed, a crack in the wall of secrecy that could not be patched over. The overseer's silence was more threatening than any outburst, signaling that the information had been filed away for future use, a weapon waiting for the right moment to be deployed. The incident with the overseer served as a brutal splash of cold water, shattering the illusion of immunity that Isadora had constructed around their meetings. The garden, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, every bush and tree a potential hiding spot for a spy. She realized that the clock was ticking, that the judge's suspicion, once fully awakened, would be impossible to assuage. Yet, despite the fear that now clawed at her throat, she found herself unable to sever the connection. The bond forged in the crucible of shared vulnerability had become the central pillar of her identity. To remove it would be to collapse the structure of her soul. The stakes had been laid bare, scandal and ruin for her, torture and death for him. The realization marked the transition from a secret romance to a tragic inevitability, a collision course with a destiny that had been written the moment they first locked eyes. The internal dynamics of Briarwood Hall shifted imperceptibly, yet decisively, in the wake of the encounter near the irrigation lines, transforming the atmosphere from one of benign neglect to predatory surveillance. Judge Vance, a man whose political survival depended on the early detection of dissent, immediately recognized the subtle erosion of his domestic authority. While he lacked concrete evidence of impropriety, his intuition, honed by decades of navigating the treacherous currents of Mississippi politics, signaled a breach in the perimeter of his control. He did not confront his wife directly. Instead, he initiated a campaign of strategic observation, tracking her movements with the same cold precision he applied to mapping crop yields. The judge understood that a direct accusation without proof was a sign of weakness, whereas the silent accumulation of intelligence was an assertion of power. Mr. Pinter, the overseer, found himself the recipient of increased scrutiny from the judge, who began to demand detailed reports on the daily assignments of the estate's labor force. The logs from this period show a sudden, minute interest in the rotation of skilled workers, particularly those stationed near the main house. Pinter, sensing the shift in the wind, understood that his own position was contingent on his ability to anticipate the judge's concerns before they were voiced. He recalled the scene in the garden, the proximity of the mistress to the handyman, the startled look in her eyes, and recognized the dangerous potential of the memory. The overseer's role transitioned from that of a driver of labor to a custodian of the master's domestic honor, a promotion that carried with it the implicit threat of violent enforcement. For Isadora, the mansion transformed from a sanctuary of silence into a panopticon where every creak of the floorboards and every glance from a servant felt like a deposition. She became acutely aware of the architecture of her confinement, noting how the placement of windows allowed for unobstructed sight lines from the judge's study to the garden paths. Her movements within the house took on a performative quality, designed to project an image of innocent routine that masked the frantic rhythm of her pulse. She forced herself to spend hours in the drawing room, practicing scales on the piano, with a mechanical repetition she hoped would serve as an auditory mask for her internal chaos. Yet, the effort to appear normal only highlighted the abnormality of her previous months of vibrancy. The psychological toll of this surveillance began to manifest in physical symptoms, documented in the inventories of the estate's medical supplies. Requests for laudanum and tinctures for nerves appeared with increasing frequency, suggesting a woman fraying at the edges under the weight of constant fear. Isadora found herself caught in a paradox of her own making. The source of her anxiety was the fear of losing Jonah, yet the act of seeking him out was the very behavior that jeopardized his safety. This cognitive dissonance plagued her waking hours and invaded her sleep, resulting in a state of chronic exhaustion that she struggled to conceal behind the rouge and powder of her toilette. The vitality that had so annoyed the judge was receding, replaced by a brittle fragility that he mistakenly attributed to feminine hysteria. Jonah, operating within the brutal logic of the enslaved, sensed the shift in the estate's weather patterns long before Isadora could articulate it. He noticed the increased presence of Pinter in areas previously left to autonomous management, the way the overseer's horse would appear on the horizon during times that coincided with Isadora's walks. The unspoken code of the quarters dictated that he maintain an attitude of stoic indifference, but internally he was calculating the rapidly narrowing odds of survival. He knew that the protection offered by his skill as a handyman was a flimsy shield against the accusation of a white man, and that the mistress's favor was a double-edged sword that could just as easily sever his neck as save his spirit. The inevitable adjustment to the estate's labor roster arrived in the form of a terse directive from Judge Vance, delivered via Mr. Pinter on a humid morning in mid-July. The order cited the need for structural repairs on the overseer's own residence as a pretext for reassigning Jonah to a location further from the main house. However, a contradictory clause in the instructions also mandated that Jonah remain on call for tasks specifically within the mansion's immediate perimeter, creating a logistical paradox. This administrative confusion was not accidental. It was a calculated maneuver to disrupt the established pattern of Isadora's interactions, while keeping the target within striking distance. The judge was tightening the net, testing the reactions of both parties to the altered configuration. When Isadora next descended to the garden, she found the space devoid of the familiar figure, the silence of the rustling leaves now ominous rather than peaceful. The absence was a tangible shock, a confirmation that the invisible thread connecting them had been spotted and was now being pulled taut by an unseen hand. She lingered by the irrigation pump, her fingers tracing the metal he had last touched, feeling a desperate need to verify that he had not been sold or punished in the night. The panic rising in her throat was a bitter mixture of grief and terror, a preview of the void that would consume her if the connection were severed. The garden had ceased to be a meeting place. It was now a crime scene, waiting to be fully exposed. Her desperation drove her to breach the unspoken rules of the household in a new way, seeking information from the only source available to her. She intercepted Aunt Cece in the pantry, framing her inquiry as a concern for the estate's maintenance schedule. The older woman, whose face was a map of survival, did not break her stoic expression, but her eyes conveyed a warning that cut through Isadora's feigned nonchalance. Cece confirmed the reassignment with a deliberate vagueness that shielded them both from direct complicity, yet her tone imparted the gravity of the situation. The cook knew that the reassignment was a tactical move in a larger game, one where the stakes were measured in blood rather than dollars. The realization that her husband was actively intervening in the arrangement was a watershed moment for Isadora, marking the transition from private transgression to open warfare. She understood that Judge Vance was not merely suspicious, he was hunting. The game had changed from one of avoidance to one of survival, requiring a recalibration of her own strategies. She could no longer rely on the cloak of routine. She would have to actively manufacture reasons to cross paths with Jonah, or resign herself to the death of her soul. The decision to continue was no longer a matter of passion, but of existential necessity. She was no longer merely a restless wife, She was a conspirator in a plot against the established order. Isadora's next move was a calculated risk, utilizing the pretense of charitable visitation to justify a journey toward the outskirts of the estate where Jonah had been reassigned. She ordered the carriage prepared, citing a desire to deliver medicine to an ailing field hand, a task well within the purview of a benevolent mistress. This excursion represented a dangerous escalation, taking her pursuit out of the sheltered confines of the garden and into the open territory of the plantation roads. It was a gamble that exposed her to the full view of the white overseers and the black field hands alike, trading secrecy for a moment of contact. The tension of the drive was palpable, every jolt of the carriage wheels grinding against her nerves. The destination was a cluster of sheds near the overseer's house, a zone that existed under the direct surveillance of Mr. Pinter. Arriving there was an act of defiance that screamed its intent to anyone with the wit to read the signs. Isadora stepped down from the carriage, her parasol held tight against the glare of the sun, fully aware that she was walking into the lion's den. She saw Jonah in the distance, his figure unmistakable against the backdrop of the sheds, and the sight of him alive and upright sent a wave of relief crashing through her. But as their eyes met across the expanse of dirt and grass, the connection was no longer a private sanctuary. It was a public confession, broadcast to the watching eyes of the estate. The final act of the drama had begun, and the audience was now fully assembled. The encounter near the overseer's sheds was brief, lasting no more than a few minutes according to the internal clock of the driver who awaited the mistress, but its psychological duration was immeasurable. Isadora accomplished her stated goal of delivering a poultice to the ailing worker, yet her true objective was achieved in the locking of eyes with Jonah across the dusty expanse. He did not cease his labor, nor did he acknowledge her with any gesture that could be construed as familiarity, maintaining the rigid posture of submission required in the presence of white authority. However, the intensity of his gaze conveyed a message of profound alarm, a silent warning that her presence in that quadrant of the estate was a dangerous overreach. The visit served as a confirmation of life, but it also served to accelerate the timeline of the inevitable confrontation. Judge Vance received a full report of the excursion before the sun had set, the details relayed by Mr. Pinter with the efficiency of a military aide. The overseer noted the unnecessary nature of the visit, pointing out that the afflicted field hand had been attended to by the estate's physician only the day prior. This discrepancy, the mistress performing the work of a nurse, was framed not as an act of charity, but as a deviation from the established order of the household. The judge listened without interrupting, his face a mask of judicial neutrality, though the tightening of his jaw suggested a rising temperature of anger. The report confirmed his suspicion that the anomaly in his wife's behavior was not a passing fancy, but a deliberate pursuit of a specific target. The domestic atmosphere at Briarwood Hall curdled rapidly in the days following the excursion, transforming the mansion into a theater of cold warfare. Meals, once occasions for stilted conversation, became exercises in agonizing silence, with the judge scrutinizing his wife across the expanse of the mahogany table with a predatory stillness. He made no direct accusation, preferring the weapon of psychological pressure, forcing Isadora to sit with the knowledge that she was being weighed and measured. The servants moved through the room like ghosts, sensing the violent potential vibrating beneath the surface of the judge's calm, terrified that a dropped spoon or a misplaced dish might serve as the catalyst for an explosion. The tension was no longer a hum in the background. It was a deafening roar. Isadora attempted to navigate this minefield by retreating into the persona of the invalid, claiming headaches and fatigue to justify her seclusion in her chambers. This strategy of withdrawal was a double-edged sword. While it removed her from the immediate line of sight, it also deprived her of the ability to monitor the judge's movements or gather intelligence on Jonah's status. Isolated in her room, she became dependent on the fragmented reports of the house staff, whispers carried up the back stairs that spoke of increased surveillance in the quarters and the confiscation of personal items. The isolation fed her paranoia, conjuring images of brutality and punishment that played behind her eyelids whenever she attempted to rest. The walls of her bedroom, once a refuge, began to feel like the cell of a prisoner awaiting sentencing. The repressive heat of late July exacerbated the fraying nerves of everyone on the estate, creating a pressure cooker environment where a spark could ignite a conflagration. The judge's political rivals in Natchez were circling, and his financial investments were facing uncertainty due to a fluctuating cotton market. Historians note that periods of intense heat often correlated with spikes in violence on plantations, and the summer of 1852 was proving to be exceptionally brutal. Judge Vance, feeling the squeeze on his authority, was primed to reassert his dominance in the one domain where he held absolute power: his household. The combination of political pressure and domestic suspicion created a volatile chemical mixture that threatened to detonate at the slightest provocation. Mr. Pinter, acting on vague instructions to tighten the discipline, began a campaign of petty harassments against the enslaved workforce, particularly those suspected of facilitating the mistress's movements. Rations were inspected with a fine tooth comb, work hours were extended under the glare of torchlight, and the slightest infraction was met with the lash. This wave of terror was designed to sever the lines of communication between the big house and the quarters, to ensure that no message could pass without the overseer's knowledge. The strategy was effective. The house servants grew distant, their eyes averted, their voices silent, terrified that a sympathetic word to the mistress would result in a death sentence for their families in the fields. Isadora found herself suddenly alone, cut off from the network of support that had sustained her. It was in this atmosphere of suffocating dread that Aunt Cece made the decision to intervene, realizing that silence was no longer a viable form of protection. The older woman had witnessed the cycle of destruction before, watching other white women and black men fall into the abyss of the plantation's power dynamics, and she knew the ending was always the same. She waited for a moment when the judge was distracted by business in his study, intercepting Isadora in the narrow corridor leading to the kitchen. The setting was deliberate. The hallway was a blind spot in the house's architecture, offering a sliver of privacy that was otherwise non-existent. Cece's face was grave, her bearing devoid of the usual deference, transforming her from a servant into a matriarch delivering a decree. "Miss Isadora," she began, her voice a low rumble that barely rose above a whisper. "You is walking on the edge of a razor." The words were devoid of comfort, stripped of any softness by the urgency of the situation. She did not mention Jonah by name, nor did she explicitly detail the nature of the affair, for to speak the truth aloud was to invite the very calamity she sought to prevent. Instead, she spoke in the coded language of the oppressed, a dialect of metaphor and warning that Isadora had learned to interpret during her years in the South. Cece detailed the changes in the judge's demeanor, the specific questions he had asked regarding her daily routines, and the dangerous interest Mr. Pinter was taking in the handyman's schedule. "You think you is careful," Cece continued, her eyes boring into Isadora's with a fierce, protective intensity. "But you is careless with a man's life. The judge, he smells a rat in the walls, and he aimed to poison the whole house to get it out." The cook explained the calculus of power with a brutal clarity. For Isadora, the penalty was scandal and divorce. For Jonah, the penalty was rope and fire. She recounted the history of the county, listing the names of men who had been lynched for far lesser offenses than a shared look or a stolen conversation. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on Isadora. The reality of her complicity in the danger facing Jonah finally breaking through her romantic idealism. Isadora's response was a strangled whisper, a plea for guidance that revealed her utter helplessness. "I only wished to speak with him," she said, the excuse sounding hollow even to her own ears, "to feel that I am not alone." "Loneliness is a luxury the living enjoy," Cece countered sharply, cutting through the self-pity. "Dead men ain't lonely. They just dead." She pressed a small parcel of food into Isadora's hands, a bundle of biscuits wrapped in cloth, and gently but firmly pushed her back toward the main hall. "You stay away from them sheds. You stay away from that garden. You save that man by leaving him be." The interaction ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Isadora standing alone in the hallway, the food in her hand feeling like a heavy stone of judgment. The warning from Aunt Tisse marked the final collapse of Isadora's denial, forcing her to confront the moral architecture of her situation. She retreated to her chamber, not to sleep, but to grapple with the terrifying implications of the cook's words. She realized that her desire for connection had blinded her to the mechanics of the system she inhabited, a system designed to convert intimacy into a weapon of destruction. The internal pacing of her life shifted, moving from the rhythm of stolen moments to the countdown of an executioner's clock. The judge's silence was no longer a comfort. It was a suspension bridge, and the cables were beginning to snap one by one. Isadora understood with sudden clarity that the narrative had passed the point of no return, and that the only remaining variable was who would pay the price for the transgression. The morning of July 28th, 1852, broke with a suffocating stillness, the air heavy and motionless over the Mississippi Delta. The heat wave that had gripped the region for weeks intensified, creating a shimmering haze over the cotton fields that distorted the horizon and made breathing a labor. Meteorological records from the period indicate that river levels had dropped to historic lows, creating a sense of claustrophobia across the plantations that lined the banks. At Briarwood, this atmospheric pressure seemed to press down on the very foundations of the house, slowing the movements of the household staff and silencing the usual morning chatter. The estate felt suspended in amber, waiting for a catalyst to shatter the fragile calm that Judge Vance had imposed through his recent displays of power. Isadora awoke with a sense of impending doom, her sleep having been plagued by nightmares of fire and falling that left her physically drained. The warning from Aunt Cece echoed in her mind, merging with the memory of Jonah's terrified gaze to form a constant internal drumbeat of anxiety. She dressed with mechanical precision, choosing a dress of heavy grey silk that seemed inappropriate for the temperature, but which served as a suit of armor against the vulnerability she felt. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman possessed by a quiet desperation, her eyes too bright, her movements too sharp. The routine of the household, breakfast, correspondence, needlepoint, felt like a grotesque parody of normalcy, a play being performed on a stage set for a tragedy. Downstairs, the judge was in a mood of terrifying geniality, engaging Isadora in conversation about the upcoming social season with a casualness that felt forced. He inquired about her health, his eyes scanning her face for cracks in her composure, his tone light, but his gaze heavy. The performance was designed to unsettle, to create a false sense of security that could be snatched away at any moment, and Isadora felt its manipulative weight acutely. She responded with monosyllables, playing the part of the submissive wife, but every fiber of her being was tuned to the frequency of the estate beyond the windows. She knew that the judge's pleasant demeanor was a mask for the predator preparing to strike. Mr. Pinter arrived at the main house mid-morning, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel drive, a sound that carried through the open windows like a gunshot. He requested a private audience with the judge, a meeting that was immediately granted, the two men disappearing into the study and closing the heavy oak doors. To the house servants, this was the signal they had been dreading, the confirmation that the collection of intelligence had concluded and the phase of judgment was about to begin. The silence that followed Pinter's arrival was profound, the kind of silence that falls over a landscape before a tornado touches down. Isadora sat in the parlor, her needlepoint forgotten in her lap, counting the minutes, each one stretching into an eternity of dread. The meeting lasted precisely 30 minutes, a span of time documented by the clock in the hallway, which Isadora watched with hypnotic intensity. When the door finally opened, the judge emerged alone, his face set in hard lines, while Pinter slipped out the back toward the quarters. The judge did not look at Isadora as he passed the parlor door, his stride purposeful as he ascended the stairs to change his clothes. This lack of acknowledgement was more terrifying than any direct confrontation. It suggested that she was no longer a participant in the drama, but an object to be dealt with. The machinery of the estate had been engaged, and the cogs were turning toward a conclusion that she was powerless to influence. Driven by a frantic need to know, Isadora sought out Aunt Cece in the kitchen, finding the older woman standing by the window, watching the road to the quarters. Cece's face was a mask of resignation, her hands clasped tightly in her apron. "They bringin' him up," she said, her voice devoid of hope, answering Isadora's unasked question. "Mr. Pinter, he gone to fetch Jonah from the fields." The words landed with the force of a physical blow, confirming Isadora's worst fears. The judge had bypassed her entirely, going straight to the source of his humiliation. There would be no trial, no opportunity for explanation. There would only be the brutal execution of power. Isadora felt a surge of adrenaline that overrode her fear, propelling her toward the back door. She had to see him, had to warn him or intervene, though she knew intellectually that any interference would only seal his fate faster. The logic of the plantation allowed for no rescue, no last-minute reprieve, yet her heart refused to accept the mathematical certainty of the outcome. She stepped out onto the veranda, the heat hitting her like a physical wall, and looked toward the lane that connected the fields to the main house. In the distance, a cloud of dust was rising, signifying the approach of a group on foot. The procession was slow, deliberate, designed to maximize the terror for the onlookers. The group came into focus as they neared the house, Mr. Pinter walking in front, 2 other white overseers flanking a central figure, and a small group of enslaved field hands trailing at a respectful, terrified distance. Jonah was walking with a shambling gait, his hands bound in front of him with rough hemp rope, his shirt torn and stained with dirt. He did not lift his head, his eyes fixed on the ground, but Isadora could see the swelling on his face, the evidence of a summary beating delivered in the fields before the march began. The sight of his physical degradation shattered something inside her, the last vestige of the illusion that her status could protect either of them. Judge Vance appeared on the veranda beside Isadora, dressed now in his judicial blacks, a sartorial choice that lent the proceedings a grotesque air of legality. He did not look at his wife, keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching prisoner, his expression one of cold, bureaucratic detachment. "There are matters that require my attention," he said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. "You will retire to your chambers, Isadora. You will not leave them until I send for you." It was not a request. It was a command delivered with the full weight of his authority as husband and master. Isadora turned to her husband, her desperation spilling over into defiance. "Silas, please," she whispered, the words barely audible. "He did nothing. I went to him. It was my doing." The confession was a final, desperate gamble, an attempt to claim the burden of guilt and shift the target of the judge's wrath. But the judge merely turned his cold gaze upon her, his eyes empty of anything resembling recognition or mercy. "You forget your place," he said softly, "and you insult my intelligence." He signaled to a house servant standing by the door. "Escort the mistress to her room. Lock the door." Isadora was led away, her legs trembling, her protest smothered by the strength of the servant who guided her up the stairs. She did not struggle, knowing that resistance was futile and would only add to the spectacle. As she reached the landing, she looked back one last time to see the procession arriving at the foot of the veranda steps. Jonah had lifted his head now, his eyes scanning the facade of the house, searching for something. For a fraction of a second, his gaze found the window of the landing where Isadora stood. There was no fear in his expression, only a profound, sorrowful acceptance, a look that acknowledged the end of their stolen time. Then the overseers pushed him forward, toward the barn that served as the estate's impromptu tribunal, and the vision was lost to the heat and the dust. The locking of the chamber door acted as a definitive severance, isolating Isadora within a vacuum of silence that was far louder than the muffled sounds of the estate below. She stood motionless in the center of the room, the click of the tumblers echoing like a gavel strike in a courtroom, finalizing the verdict of her confinement. The room, once a sanctuary of perceived safety, instantly transformed into a cell, its familiar furnishings now seemingly hostile witnesses to her helplessness. Isadora stood motionless in the center of the room, the click of the tumblers echoing like a gavel strike in a courtroom. The heavy mahogany furniture and thick Persian rugs, symbols of her elevated status, offered no comfort against the crushing realization of her absolute lack of agency. She was no longer the mistress of Briarwood. She was merely another piece of property being held in storage while the master conducted his business. From her vantage point at the window, she could see the rear courtyard, a space usually reserved for the orderly movements of supplies and servants, now transformed into a theater of impending violence. The group had come to a halt near the entrance to the barn, the structure serving as the estate's secondary hub of operations. Judge Vance descended the steps with the measured pace of a magistrate approaching the bench, his black coat contrasting sharply with the bleached white of the gravel drive. The visual composition of the scene was striking in its cruelty. The tall, imposing figure of the law-bearing husband standing over the bound, kneeling form of the handyman. The heat radiating from the ground shimmered, distorting the figures like a mirage, lending the entire proceeding a surreal, nightmarish quality. Mr. Pinter stepped forward to address the judge, his posture obsequious as he presented the prisoner. Though the glass of the window dampened the sound, the body language was unmistakably clear. The overseer was recounting the evidence, likely embellished to ensure a capital verdict. Jonah remained on his knees, his posture rigid, but his head held high, refusing to cower even as the noose of the judge's judgment tightened around him. Isadora strained to catch a glimpse of his face, desperate for a sign, but the angle of the sun cast his features in shadow. The distance between the window and the courtyard felt infinite, a chasm of power that she could not bridge with whispers or pleas. A small crowd had begun to gather at the periphery of the courtyard, comprised of house servants and field hands who had been drawn by the grim gravity of the event. They stood in a loose semicircle, their faces masks of passive obedience that hid the terror and empathy beneath. This audience was a necessary component of the plantation's justice system. The punishment of one was intended as a lesson for the many, a public declaration of the master's dominion. The presence of the enslaved witnesses added a layer of grotesque theatricality to the scene, turning the courtyard into a stage where the doctrine of white supremacy was acted out in real time. Isadora watched Aunt Cece standing apart from the group, her arms folded, her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing to witness the degradation of a man she had tried to save. Judge Vance began to speak, his gestures sharp and economical, outlining the charges that required no proof other than his suspicion. The crime was not an action, but an intent. The transgression was not a theft of goods, but a theft of the boundary that separated white from black. To the judge, the violation of his domestic order was indistinguishable from treason against the state, a breach of the fundamental law of the South. He paced back and forth before Jonah, his riding crop tapping rhythmically against his boot, a metronome counting down the seconds to destruction. The interrogation was a formality, a ritual designed to affirm the master's will rather than uncover the truth. The tension in the courtyard escalated visibly when the judge halted his pacing, and turned abruptly toward the barn, issuing a sharp command to Mr. Pinter. The overseer disappeared into the shadows of the building, re-emerging moments later carrying a heavy iron chain and a whip with a long, braided lash. The sight of these implements sent a ripple of dread through the watching crowd, a physical flinch that seemed to pass from person to person, like a wind through wheat. The judge was bypassing the noose, choosing instead a punishment that would prolong the suffering and ensure that the warning was etched in flesh. The choice of the whip over the rope was a calculated decision to maximize terror while retaining the value of the property. Isadora stumbled back from the window, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream that clawed at her throat. The realization of what was about to happen hit her with the force of a physical blow, shattering the numbness that had protected her. She rushed to the door, gripping the handle with frantic strength, shaking it against the lock in a futile attempt to break free. The wood held firm, indifferent to her desperation. She pounded her fists against the heavy panels, screaming her husband's name, screaming for Pinter to stop, but her voice was absorbed by the thick walls, dying in the airless vacuum of the room. She was reduced to a beating heart and a panicked mind, trapped in a cage of her own making. A crack echoed across the grounds, a sound that was not quite a gunshot, but carried the same violent finality. It was the whip breaking the sound barrier, followed instantly by the sickening thud of leather striking flesh. Isadora pressed her back against the door, sliding down until she hit the floor, covering her ears with her hands to shut out the rhythm of the punishment. But the sounds penetrated her defenses, the guttural grunts of exertion from the overseer, the wet impact of the lash, and the heavy, labored breathing of the victim. Jonah made no cry of pain, a silence that was more devastating to Isadora than any scream could have been. The whipping continued for what felt like an eternity, a brutal cadence that marked the passage of time in strokes of agony. Each crack of the whip was a negation of the conversations in the garden, a violent erasure of the humanity Isadora had recognized in Jonah. The judge watched the proceedings with clinical detachment, ensuring that the punishment was administered with the requisite severity. This was the climax of the domestic drama, the moment where the abstract tensions of the summer were transmuted into concrete, blood-soaked reality. The judge was reclaiming his authority, writing his dominion in scars on the back of the man who had dared to look his wife in the eye. When the sounds finally ceased, the silence that followed was heavier than the heat. Isadora remained curled on the floor, her body shaking with silent sobs, the physical evidence of her failure staining the carpet. The judge's voice drifted up from below, giving orders for the prisoner to be taken away, his tone as casual as if he were instructing a gardener to prune a hedge. The business of the estate would continue, the ledgers would be balanced, and the machinery of production would grind on. But for Isadora, the world had contracted to the four walls of her prison, and the memory of the sound of leather on skin, a memory that would haunt the rest of her days. The door handle rattled, followed by the scrape of a key in the lock, signaling the return of the world she had tried to escape. Isadora scrambled to her feet, wiping her face with the back of her hand, attempting to compose herself into some semblance of the wife the judge expected. But as the door swung open to reveal the empty corridor, She knew that the woman who had walked the garden paths with a forbidden hope was gone. In her place stood a figure of broken statuary, a monument to a moment of rebellion that had been brutally, efficiently, and utterly crushed. The tragedy had reached its zenith, leaving only the wreckage in its wake. The unlocking of the chamber door did not signify liberation, but rather a transfer into a more insidious form of captivity. Isadora emerged from her room to find the hallway quiet, the house servants moving with their heads bowed, their eyes averted as if she were a ghost haunting the corridors of Briarwood. The judge did not return to the main house immediately. Instead, he remained in his study, updating the estate ledgers with a chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. The entry for July 28th notes a correction regarding property number 62, a euphemism that masked the brutality of the afternoon. The house felt desolate, stripped of the vibrant, dangerous energy that had defined the summer, leaving behind a sterile silence. Isadora walked to the window, drawn by a compulsion to witness the aftermath of the judge's decree. In the distance, near the entrance to the slave hospital, a cart was being loaded. Jonah lay motionless on the bed of the wagon, his body covered by a rough canvas, though a dark stain was already spreading through the fabric. He was being transported to the Cripple House, a designated area for those whose productive capacity had been damaged by punishment. This removal was the final stroke of the judge's strategy. He had not killed Jonah, for that would have meant a financial loss of $1,200, but he had effectively erased him from the visible world of the estate. The handyman who had spoken with such dignity was now reduced to a ledger entry of damaged goods. The realization of her own complicity in this ruin settled upon Isadora with suffocating weight. Aunt Cece's warning had not been a prophecy, but a statement of inevitable mechanics, and Isadora had failed to heed the distinction. She had mistaken her privilege for power, believing that her status as a white woman could shield Jonah from the consequences of their connection. Instead, her pursuit of him had been the very instrument of his destruction. The intimacy they had shared, the stolen moments of poetry and pain, had been deconstructed by the judge and repurposed as a weapon. Every word she had spoken to Jonah had been transmuted into a lash across his back. Judge Vance finally emerged from his study as the sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the veranda. He ascended the stairs and paused at the threshold of the parlor where Isadora sat, staring blankly at a piece of needlepoint she had not touched in weeks. He did not enter the room, but stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light. "The distraction has been removed," he stated, his voice devoid of any inflection. "We will not speak of this again. You will resume your duties as Mistress of Briarwood." The command was absolute, a royal decree that sought to rewrite the history of the summer as a mere unpleasantness. The finality in his tone was a wall that Isadora could not breach. There was no room for argument, no space for grief, only the imperative to perform. She looked at her husband and saw the void where a soul should have been, a man capable of ordering the flaying of a human being and then retiring to dinner. The moral thesis of the story was laid bare in that moment. The system did not require monsters to function, only men willing to uphold the logic of property at the expense of humanity. Judge Vance turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing with the rhythm of a man who had successfully defended his castle against a siege. That night, the mansion felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. Isadora lay in her bed, the silence of the house broken only by the distant, rhythmic breathing of the judge beside her. She did not weep. The capacity for tears seemed to have been scorched out of her by the heat of the afternoon. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, her mind cycling through the memories of the garden. The irony was bitter. In seeking to escape the loneliness of her marriage, she had condemned a man to a lifetime of agony. The connection she had prized had been a trap, baited with her own desperation. In the days that followed, a rigid normalcy descended upon Briarwood Hall, a facade of order that was brittle enough to crack under pressure. Isadora performed her role with mechanical precision, managing the household, overseeing the kitchen, and attending church on Sundays. The servants treated her with a terrified respect, keeping their distance as if her touch carried a contagion of bad luck. The garden, once the secret heart of the estate, was now a wasteland of weeds and tangled vines, a neglected patch of ground that Isadora never visited. The route she had walked with such anticipation was now a path of ghosts. The judge's triumph was total. He had not only punished the transgressor, but had reclaimed his wife, breaking her spirit in a way that her initial marriage contract never could. Isadora became the ideal wife he had always desired, silent, compliant, and entirely present in body, while absent in soul. The vibrancy that had irritated him was gone, replaced by a palatable hollowness. He had proven that the institution of slavery was not merely a labor system, but a mechanism for enforcing order in every sphere of life, from the fields to the marital bed. Historians examining the estate records from late 1852 note a distinct change in the tone of Isadora's correspondence. Her letters, previously filled with observations about local society and family news, became brief and perfunctory, devoid of the personality that had once characterized her writing. To the outside world, she was the picture of Southern grace, but those who looked closely could see the cracks in the porcelain. She had been shattered and reassembled, a broken vessel held together by the pressure of social expectation. The story of Isadora and Jonah did not end with a heroic escape or a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet annihilation. The judge's decision to keep Jonah alive was a cruelty more profound than death, for it served as a permanent reminder of the cost of defiance. Every time Isadora looked out her window, she knew he was there, existing in a purgatory of pain on the edge of the property. The estate was a closed loop of power, and there was no exit from its circumference. The summer of 1852 ended not with a storm, but with a drought, a drying up of the soul that left the land cracked and barren. The legend of Briarwood, however, would eventually grow beyond the confines of the judge's ledgers. In the years to come, the story of the mistress and the handyman would be whispered in the quarters, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale of love and death. It became a ghost story, a mythologization of a moment when the hierarchy trembled. The story expanded from a personal tragedy into a legend of the Delta, a testament to the high stakes of the human heart in a world built on the denial of humanity. The walls of Briarwood had held, but the echo of the scream, or rather, the silence where a scream should have been, would reverberate through the history of the estate long after the principals had turned to dust. The archival record concerning the immediate aftermath of the events of July 18th, 52, is fragmented, relying heavily on the oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s. These testimonies, passed down through generations of families who remained in the Natchez area, suggest that the psychological topography of Briarwood Hall was permanently altered. The mansion, once a symbol of impregnable order, acquired a reputation in the surrounding county as a place of bad air, a euphemism for the lingering presence of unresolved trauma. Neighbors noted a decrease in the judge's social engagements. The lavish parties that had defined the social season ceased entirely, replaced by a hermetic isolation that fueled speculation among the planter class. The silence that Isadora had adopted as a shield became the defining characteristic of the estate, a heavy, suffocating blanket that stifled the usual rhythms of Southern aristocracy. Judge Vance's personal correspondence, housed in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, reveals a shift in his business dealings during the autumn of that year. He began to divest from the more speculative ventures in the Delta, consolidating his assets into safer, more tangible holdings, perhaps sensing the fragility of the world he had fought so hard to control. Letters to his factors in New Orleans became terse and paranoid, filled with instructions regarding the security of his property and the trustworthiness of his agents. The confidence that had characterized his early career had been eroded by the realization that his domestic kingdom was vulnerable to the intangible forces of human connection. He had won the battle for authority, but the victory had cost him the peace of mind that was supposed to accompany absolute power. Isadora Vance remained at Briarwood for another 17 years, a fixture of the estate who aged rapidly under the weight of her internalized grief. Census records list her presence, but fail to capture the quality of her existence, which was described by contemporaries as a living death. She never again visited the garden, leaving it to grow wild and tangled, a visible scar on the manicured landscape of the grounds. Servants reported that she would often stand at the window of her chamber for hours, staring not at the river or the fields, but at the low outbuilding near the edge of the property where Jonah had been housed after his recovery. She did not weep, and she did not smile. She simply existed, a monument to the cost of the system her husband championed. Jonah's fate is documented in the estate's medical logs and the depreciation schedules of the plantation accounts. He survived the whipping, a testament to a physical resilience that the judge had calculated into his economic decision-making. However, he was permanently disabled, his mobility reduced to a shuffling gait that limited his value to light tasks within the quarters. The ledgers for 1853 reclassify him from field hand to invalid, a bureaucratic reduction that stripped him of his identity as a man of skill and strength. He lived for another 6 years, dying in the winter of 1858, the cause of death listed simply as pneumonia, though the oral tradition maintains it was a broken heart. His grave is unmarked, lost among the rows of anonymous mounds in the slave cemetery. But his story survived him. The mechanism of mythologization began almost immediately after the whipping, as the enslaved community sought to process the trauma through narrative. In the safety of the quarters, Away from the listening ears of the overseers, the story of the mistress and the handyman was refined into a parable. It was not told as a romance, which would have been too dangerous and too naive, but as a tragedy of cosmic proportions. Jonah became a figure of stoic martyrdom, a man who had looked the master in the eye and refused to blink, while Isadora was cast as the tragic victim of a system that devoured its own. This transformation of historical fact into folklore served a vital psychological function, allowing the community to assert a measure of ownership over a narrative that the judge had tried to bury in silence. By the time the Civil War swept through Mississippi in 1862, the legend of Briarwood had taken on a life of its own. Union soldiers encamped near the estate reported hearing stories from the newly freed enslaved people about the ghost of the garden, a spectral figure said to walk the overgrown paths at dusk. These reports, while dismissed by military brass as superstition, speak to the enduring power of the story to infuse the physical landscape with meaning. The overgrown garden became a site of memory, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the free and the enslaved, seemed porous. The war that destroyed the institution of slavery also cemented the story's place in the local history, a final testament to the human cost of the peculiar institution. Judge Vance did not live to see the collapse of the world he had built. He died in the spring of 1861, just months after the secession of Mississippi. His death was attributed to a sudden apoplexy, though the oral history suggests a more gradual decline, a rotting from the inside out. He left behind a massive estate, valued at over $400,000, a fortune that would be rendered worthless within 4 years by the defeat of the Confederacy. His legacy, preserved in stone and paper, proved as fragile as the human relationships he had tried to crush. He passed away in his sleep, alone in the massive bed he had shared with a wife who had long since retreated into a world of her own, leaving behind a hollow empire. Isadora survived the war, living out her final years in the decaying grandeur of Briarwood. She refused to leave the estate, even as the house fell into disrepair and the fields returned to wilderness. In her will, a document discovered in the Natchez probate court, she left a small, specific bequest, a sum of $50 to be used for the maintenance of the slave cemetery. It was a gesture of atonement that went unnoticed by the legal authorities, but resonated deeply with the local black community. The bequest was the only public acknowledgement she ever made of the debt she felt she owed, a final, silent confession of the love and loss that had defined her life. The story of Isadora and Jonah serves as a microcosm of the broader tragedy of the South, illustrating the dehumanizing effects of slavery on both the enslaved and the enslavers. It challenges the romanticized narratives of the lost cause, stripping away the veneer of chivalry to reveal the brutal mechanics of control and the violence required to maintain it. The pseudo-documentary evidence, ledgers, letters, census data, provides the skeleton of the story, but the soul of the narrative resides in the gaps and silences of the archive. It is a reminder that history is not just the record of what was written down, but also the echo of what was suppressed. The summer of 1852 remains a fixed point in the history of Briarwood, a season of heat and blood that refused to fade into the past. The structural analysis of the event reveals a point of no return, not just for the characters, but for the institution they inhabited The transgression of Isadora and Jonah was a crack in the foundation of the plantation system, a demonstration that the human spirit could not be entirely subjugated by laws or whips. Their story, preserved through myth and memory, stands as a testament to the enduring power of connection in the face of overwhelming oppression. The archives eventually close, the paper yellows, and the ink fades, but the narrative logic of the story persists. It ends not with a resolution, but with a resonant silence, a space for the viewer to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past. The tragedy of Isadora Vance and Jonah is that they were born into a world that denied their humanity. Yet in their brief, stolen moments, they managed to reclaim it, paying the ultimate price for a glimpse of freedom. The story remains, a warning and a witness, echoing across the centuries.